The mountain rose before me like a sleeping giant, its peak hidden in drifting clouds. Even after centuries of walking, I had never seen a place quite like this, its slopes steep but inviting, the path worn but quiet, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The air was thin, cool, scented faintly of pine and stone. Each step felt heavier than the last, but something pulled me upward, not a voice, not a whisper, just a quiet certainty that at the top of this mountain, I would find something I didn't yet know I was looking for. I began my climb at dawn. The sun broke gently over the horizon, spilling gold across the world below. The village at the mountain's base grew smaller with each step. Its rooftops and chimneys reduced to faint shapes against the green earth. Birds circled far above, their cries carried down by the wind. Below, a river glinted like silver thread, winding through the hills before vanishing into the distance. It was quiet here, no footsteps but mine, no voices but the faint whisper of the breeze through stones. Hours passed, the path narrowed and steepened, and the air grew cooler. My breath came in soft clouds before me, and my hands brushed against rough rock and cool moss. Every so often, I paused to listen, not because I heard anything, but because it felt right too. At one bend in the path, I found a small pool of water nestled between stones. Its surface was smooth, catching the faint reflection of the clouds above. I knelt there and drank, feeling the chill of it settle in my chest like a quiet flame. Higher still, the forest that clung to the lower slopes began to thin. Pines gave way to scraggly bushes, and then to bare rock, worn smooth by wind and time. The sun had climbed high now, but the air remained cool, and the silence deepened with each step. Eventually, I came to a ridge where the path leveled out, and there I stopped. Before me lay a flat expanse of stone that stretched out toward the clouds. At its center stood a single figure, tall, still wrapped in robes the color of dusk. I stood there a long moment, watching. The figure did not move, nor turn to acknowledge me, and yet I felt his eyes on me, calm, patient, as though he had known for years that I would come to him eventually. I stepped forward slowly, my feet silent against the stone. The wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of a bell from somewhere far above, its tone soft and steady. The man remained motionless as I approached. His robes stirred faintly in the breeze, but his posture was as steady as the mountain itself. When I stopped a few paces away, he finally spoke, his voice low but clear, carried perfectly through the thin air. "You took your time," he said. His words startled me, though there was no accusation in them, only a quiet amusement, as though he had expected no less. I bowed my head slightly. "I didn't know I was coming," I admitted. He gave the faintest nod, his eyes dark and bright all at once fixed on mine. Few ever do. For a while, neither of us spoke. The wind moved between us, stirring loose stones, carrying the scent of snow and sun-warmed rock. Finally, he gestured with one hand to the flat stone beside him. "Sit," he said simply. I obeyed, settling onto the cool surface, feeling its solidity beneath me. The man turned his gaze back toward the sky, as though considering something far beyond either of us. After a long silence, he spoke again. "You've walked far," he said, not as a question, but as a simple fact. "Yes," I replied softly. "Do you know why?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "I thought I did, but now I'm not sure." His mouth curved in what might have been the faintest smile. "Good." And then he said nothing more. We sat there together as the clouds drifted past and the sun edged slowly across the sky. Below us, the world stretched out in endless green and gold, quiet and vast. Above, the threads of faint light shimmered, though at the time, I did not yet know how to see them. The sun slipped behind a thin veil of clouds, softening the light that fell over the ridge. The air grew cooler, and a faint scent of stone and wind settled around us. The man sat perfectly still beside me, his gaze fixed on some distant point I couldn't see. For a while, we did nothing but sit. The only sound was the faint whistle of air between the rocks and the occasional distant cry of a bird circling far above. I found myself breathing slower here, as though the mountain itself had taught my lungs its own rhythm. At length, the man spoke. "You've carried many things up this path," he said. I glanced at him, but his eyes remained on the horizon. "Some," I admitted quietly. He nodded once, as though that was answer enough. "Tell me," he continued, "do they feel lighter now?" I thought about that. My shoulders ached, my feet throbbed. Yet something inside me had begun to loosen, though I couldn't quite name it. Perhaps, I said. His lips curved faintly in almost smile. That is how it begins, he murmured. We fell silent again. Below, the world stretched endlessly in shades of green and gold, and I noticed how the sunlight caught in the rivers, turning them to silver ribbons winding through the hills. The man reached into the folds of his robe and drew out a small, smooth stone, worn almost to a perfect oval by time. He held it out to me, resting it in his palm. "Take it," he said. I did. The stone was cool but not cold, and heavier than it looked. Its surface was etched with faint lines that almost seemed to shimmer in the light, though no pattern revealed itself to me. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer at once. Instead, he closed his eyes and let out a slow breath. "It is what it needs to be," he said at last. "And what you need it to be." I turned the stone over in my hands, feeling its weight, its faint warmth now leaching into my fingers. "And what if I don't know what that is?" I asked softly. "Then wait," he replied. The words settled into me like snow on quiet ground. We sat together in silence again. The clouds moved slowly overhead, casting shifting shadows over the ridge. The wind curled around us, tugging at his robes, whispering through the stones. From time to time, he would speak never more than a few words at a time. "Every mountain has its own silence," he said, "and later, not every echo needs a voice, and later still, the wind remembers more than you think." Each phrase seemed to open a little more space inside me, though I couldn't have said why. I stared at the stone in my hands until the lines on its surface no longer seemed random. They reminded me of rivers, or routes, or perhaps paths winding toward something I couldn't yet see. As the light began to fade, the man rose slowly and gestured for me to follow. We walked to the far edge of the ridge, where the path narrowed again and curled upward toward a jagged peak that pierced the clouds. "This way," he said simply. I followed him, the stone still warm in my hand. The path grew narrower as we climbed, little more than a line of stone cut into the mountainside. Below us, the valley had faded into shadow, and above, the sky deepened into a quiet blue touched with silver. The man moved ahead of me, his steps unhurried, each one placed with the certainty of someone who had walked this way 1,000 times. I tried to match his pace, though the air grew thinner, and each breath felt longer, heavier. We did not speak for a long while. The sound of the wind against the cliffs and the crunch of our feet on loose stones was enough. At one point, the man stopped beside a narrow ledge where a thin stream of water trickled from the rocks. He cupped his hands, drank, and then stepped aside so I could do the same. The water was cold and sharp on my tongue, but it left a faint sweetness behind, as though it carried more than just snowmelt. When I straightened, he looked at me with those dark, steady eyes. "Everything tastes clearer here," he said quietly. I nodded, though I didn't yet understand. We continued upward. The slope grew steeper, the stones sharper. At times I stumbled, and each time he paused, turning just enough to make sure I followed. After what felt like hours, we reached a small plateau flat, ringed by jagged stones that rose like teeth around us. The air here was colder, but not unpleasant. It felt clean, unburdened. The man gestured for me to sit, and I did, resting on a smooth slab of stone at the center of the ring. He remained standing, his robes stirring faintly in the wind, and for a long time he simply watched me. Then he spoke. "This is where the silence begins," he said. I looked around at the stones, at the narrow paths that wound higher still into the clouds, and I thought I understood what he meant. But he shook his head slightly, as if reading my thoughts. "Not out there," he said, "in here." And he tapped a single finger against his chest. I lowered my gaze, unsure of what to say. He sat opposite me then, crossing his legs with the ease of someone who had done so thousands of times before. "Close your eyes," he said softly. I did. At first, all I heard was the wind and the faint echo of distant birds. Then, slowly, even those sounds faded, leaving only my own breath, steady but louder than it had ever been. And beneath that, something else, a quiet, so deep it felt alive. I opened my eyes again, and he was watching me. "You hear it now," he said, though it was not a question. I nodded. He reached into his robes and withdrew another stone, this one darker, etched with deeper lines. He placed it on the ground between us. "This is the mountain's heart," he said, "but it only beats if you listen." I reached out, hesitant, and laid my fingers on the stone. It was warm, not just from the sun, but from something deeper, something that pulsed faintly beneath the surface. I looked at him, and he inclined his head. "You have carried much," he said, "but not all of it is yours to keep." The words sank into me like water into thirsty earth. We sat there a long time, my hand resting on the stone, the silence around us growing deeper, richer, until even my breath felt as though it belonged to the mountain. We remained on that plateau for what felt like hours, though time here moved differently, slower, softer, as though the mountain itself was holding it still. My hand stayed on the stone, feeling its faint pulse against my skin. The warmth it gave off sank deeper into me, filling spaces I didn't know were empty. The man sat across from me, eyes closed now, his breathing steady. At times he would speak, his voice barely louder than the wind, short phrases that seemed to open something inside me each time. "Not every burden was meant for you," he said. And later, "The mountain keeps what you cannot." I let his words settle without trying to understand them fully. When at last he opened his eyes again, he leaned forward slightly and gestured toward my chest. "Place the stone there," he instructed. I hesitated, then did as he said. The moment the stone touched my chest, I felt its warmth spread outward, through my ribs, down my arms, into my hands. It was not heavy. Instead, it felt as though it was taking something from me quietly, gently drawing away the weight I'd carried for longer than I could remember. Memories rose, unbidden faces of those I'd lost, words I wished I'd said, names I could no longer recall. Each one drifted past me like smoke, then sank into the stone, leaving me lighter. At one point, my hands began to tremble, and the man reached out, resting his own over mine. "Let them go," he said simply, and so I did. When the trembling stopped, he withdrew his hands and leaned back. "The mountain remembers," he said, "so you don't have to." His eyes, dark and steady, held mine for a long moment before he rose. He gestured for me to follow, and together we continued upward. The path beyond the plateau was steeper still, but my steps felt easier now, as though the mountain itself was lifting me. We passed narrow ledges where the air grew colder and the wind sharper, but the warmth in my chest remained, steady and calm. At times the path would split, one branch veering into shadow, the other into light. The man never hesitated, always choosing the way that wound higher, even when it seemed a more difficult climb. At last, we reached another ledge where a solitary pine tree clung to the rock, its branches bent and weathered but alive. The man stopped there and placed his palm against its trunk. "This tree has stood here longer than you've walked," he said softly. I reached out and touched it too. The bark was rough and cold, but beneath it I could feel a faint hum, not unlike the stone. "The wind has tried to take it," he continued. "The snow has tried to bury it, but still it stands." He withdrew his hand and looked at me. "Not all things need to be carried," he said, "but some deserve to remain." I let my hand fall away and nodded. We continued upward again, the air thinning, the sky darkening into dusk. Above us, faint stars began to appear, threading the sky with soft light. Below, the world was cloaked in shadow, quiet and vast. When we stopped again, it was at another plateau, this one smaller and ringed by stones arranged in a circle. At its center, a faint light glowed pale and steady, like a lantern left waiting in the dark. The man gestured to it. "This is where we leave what we cannot take," he said. I stepped toward it, feeling the warmth in my chest swell, then lift, then settle into the quiet light at the circle's center. For the first time in centuries, I felt still. The circle of stones glowed faintly even as the stars above grew brighter. Standing within it, I could feel the quiet of the mountain settling deeper into me, as though every breath now belonged more to this place than to myself. The man watched silently as I stood in the center, my chest still warm from the stone, the faint hum still rising through my ribs like a memory I had almost forgotten. When at last he spoke, his voice was lower, softer, as though the air itself was listening. "You came here thinking you were alone," he said. I nodded slightly, though my eyes stayed on the pale light at my feet. "And yet," he continued, "you have carried the voices of countless others within you all along." The words sank into me slowly, like water into stone. He walked round the edge of the circle, his robes stirring faintly against the rocks. "Every face you've known, every word you've spoken, every silence you've kept, they are still here." At that, he stopped and looked up at the sky, and so are they. I followed his gaze. Above us, the stars no longer seemed scattered and far away. They shimmered in faint patterns now, threads of light weaving through the dark, crossing, circling, gathering above the mountain peak. Each thread pulsed faintly, as though alive, and for the first time I understood. They were not only stars, they were memories, carried upward, anchored to this place and to others like it. The man gestured toward them. "These are the ones who came before you," he said. I felt my breath catch slightly in my chest. "And the ones who will come after," he added. We stood there a while longer, the faint wind carrying with it the quiet sound of bells from somewhere far above. Then he turned and began walking again, this time toward the steepest path yet, a narrow trail that wound straight into the clouds. I followed without hesitation. The air grew colder the higher we climbed, though the warmth within me did not fade. The path cut sharply through the rocks, sometimes no wider than my foot, yet I felt no fear. Here, the wind was stronger, carrying with it the scent of snow and something older, something like memory made tangible. Above us, the clouds hung low, their edges tinged with silver from the hidden moon. The faint hum of the mountain grew louder here, not in sound but in feeling, a steady rhythm that seemed to rise from the stones into my bones. We passed through a narrow crevice where the walls almost touched, then emerged onto another ledge where the stars seemed close enough to reach. The man stopped here and rested his hand against the cliff face. "This is where the mountain listens," he murmured. He pressed his other hand to the stone and then stepped back, gesturing for me to do the same. When I placed both palms flat against the rock, I felt it, a faint pulse, slow and deep, as though the mountain itself were breathing beneath my fingers. And within that breath, faint voices stirred, not loud, not clear, but present. At first I thought they were echoes of my own memories, but then I realized they were not mine at all. They were the voices of others who had stood here before me, who had walked these same paths, who had left behind what they could no longer carry. The man spoke again, his voice quiet, but steady. "This is why the mountain endures," he said. I let my hands linger on the stone a while longer, feeling those voices settle into me, not as weight, but as warmth. When I finally stepped back, the man inclined his head, his dark eyes meeting mine for a long moment. "You are not only what you carry," he said. And then, with a faint gesture upward, he led me higher still into the waiting clouds. The path narrowed until it was little more than a line etched into the stone, flanked by clouds so thick they seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. The man walked ahead of me, his robes stirring with each quiet gust of wind. His steps remained steady, patient, never faltering even as the rocks beneath us grew slick with frost. Above us, the stars continued to weave their threads, their soft light spilling into the mist around us. At last, the path opened onto a broad, flat summit. Here, the air was still. The clouds hung low and heavy, but above them the stars shone bright and unbroken. The faint hum of the mountain rose into a quiet melody, as though every stone and shadow and breath had joined in song. The man stopped at the center of the summit, where a circle of stones surrounded a shallow basin carved into the rock. Inside the basin, water glimmered faintly, though no stream fed it. Its surface was perfectly still, reflecting both the stars above and the faint glow of the mountain below. The man gestured for me to come closer. "This," he said softly, "is where the mountain ends." I stepped closer, feeling the warmth in my chest rise with each step. He crouched beside the basin and touched the surface of the water with 2 fingers. Ripples spread outward, and with them, faint images bloomed across the reflection, faces, places, moments that shimmered like threads of light before fading again. "The mountain remembers," he murmured. I knelt beside him and looked into the water. At first I saw nothing but my own reflection. Then, slowly, shapes began to form, memories I thought I had long forgotten. A quiet smile in a crowded market, a name whispered just before dawn, a river at dusk, its surface broken by falling rain, and then other images, not mine, but somehow familiar. Hands reaching out in the dark, a voice carried on the wind, a single lantern glowing in an empty street. I watched as each one appeared, rippled, and dissolved back into the quiet water. "These are the stories that remain," the man said. He turned his gaze to me, his dark eyes steady. "You came here thinking your memories were yours alone," he continued, "but they never were." The words settled into me, quiet and certain. "The mountain keeps them," he said. "It keeps them so that you can walk on." I looked into the water again and saw my own face soften, as though some weight had finally lifted. He placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. "Let it go," he said simply. And so I did. I reached into the water with both hands, feeling its coolness settle over my skin, and let the last of what I carried slip from me into the basin. The water glowed faintly brighter, as though it had received something precious, and then stilled again. When I withdrew my hands, the warmth in my chest deepened, calmer now, more quiet. The man rose and stepped back, his eyes on the horizon beyond the clouds. I followed his gaze. The stars above seemed closer here, their threads more intricate, weaving new patterns even as I watched. And I understood then, the mountain was not only a place to climb, but a place to leave behind, to let what was no longer needed find its place among the stones and stars. We stood in silence together at the summit, the wind curling around us, the faint melody of the mountain carrying through the night. For the first time in centuries, I felt light enough to stay still. The air at the summit remained still, even as the faintest hints of dawn began to color the horizon. The man stood quietly beside me, his robes barely stirring now. The glow of the basin had softened, returning to a calm, mirror-like surface. At last, he turned to me, and with a single quiet nod, he began to walk back toward the path that had brought us here. I followed, my steps slower now, not from weariness, but because every stone, every shadow, every curl of wind felt different, lighter. We walked in silence. The threads of stars above began to fade as the first pale light of morning brushed across the clouds. Below us, the valley lay still in the shadow of the peaks, its rivers like faint silver lines waiting to wake. The path was no less steep on the way down, but my feet found it more easily, as though the mountain itself had accepted me now. The man paused at the ledge with the solitary pine tree, resting his hand against its rough trunk once more. I did the same. The tree's hum was faint, but steady, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to listen. "This tree," the man said softly, "has stood here longer than you will walk." He glanced at me then, his eyes calm, as though to say, "And yet, you will walk long enough." We continued downward. When we reached the narrow plateau with the ring of stones, the faint light at its center still glowed softly. The man stopped here, turning to me. "You may leave something here," he said, "if you choose." I placed my hand over my chest where the warmth of the mountain stone still pulsed faintly. I closed my eyes for a moment, then bent and set the smooth stone from the summit gently in the circle's center. The light of the circle brightened briefly, then returned to its steady glow. The man inclined his head slightly, as though approving, then turned and continued down the path. As we descended further, the air grew warmer, the stones softer beneath our feet. We passed the ridge where we had first met, and I saw now how the stones there glimmered faintly even in the dawn light, as though remembering what had passed between them. Below us, the village at the base of the mountain began to emerge from shadow, its rooftops catching the early sun. Birds circled above, their calls carried on the wind. The man stopped at one final turn in the path, where the slope began to level out. He faced me fully then, his eyes steady, his expression calm. "You have left what you needed to leave," he said, "and you have kept what you needed to keep." I felt the truth of his words settle into me like quiet embers. He reached into the folds of his robe and withdrew a small stone darker than the one before, its surface etched with even deeper lines. He pressed it into my hand. "This," he said, "is not a burden. It is a reminder." I looked down at the stone, feeling its weight, solid, warm, but no longer heavy. When I looked up again, the man was already stepping away, his robes catching the faint morning light. I watched him walk a little further before he paused, turned his head slightly, and spoke one last time. "Walk on," he said, and then he continued down the path, his figure fading gradually into the soft light of dawn. I stood there a while longer, the new stone resting in my hand, the faint hum of the mountain still alive in my chest. Then I, too, began to walk down into the valley, carrying the silence of the mountain with me. The path widened as I descended further, the stones softer, the air warmer with each step. Below, the valley unfolded in gentle green and gold, dotted with rooftops that caught the morning sun like quiet embers. The wind was calm now, no longer sharp and insistent as it had been higher up. It carried with it the faint scent of pine and river, and something else, something faintly sweet, like the memory of silence itself. I paused on a ledge where the view opened wide. From here, the summit was still visible above me, wrapped in a soft haze of clouds, and though I had left it behind, I could still feel its presence steady, quiet, alive within me. The stone the man had given me remained in my hand. It was warm, though the morning air was cool. Its surface felt different, no, not just a weight, but a rhythm, a reminder of something deeper than memory. I closed my fingers around it and breathed deeply. The wind stirred faintly, carrying with it the soft echo of his voice. Walk on, and so I did. The path soon curved into a small stand of pines, their branches swaying gently overhead. Sunlight filtered through them in soft golden ribbons, dappling the ground with shifting patterns. Here, the sound of the river grew louder, quiet rush that spoke of movement, of return. I followed its song until the trees opened, revealing the water itself. It flowed clear and bright over smooth stones, its surface catching the light in scattered sparks. I knelt by its edge and dipped my hands into the water. It was cold, but not unpleasant, refreshing, alive. I let it wash over my fingers, watching as the ripples moved outward and vanished into the current. For a long time I stayed there, feeling the rhythm of the water join the faint hum still alive in my chest. Then, slowly, I rose and continued on. As I approached the edge of the village, faint sounds reached me, footsteps on stone, a door opening somewhere, quiet laughter carried on the air. Life moved gently here, unhurried. A woman carrying a basket glanced up as I passed, and though she said nothing, she nodded faintly, as though she could see the mountain in my eyes. I nodded back. Children darted between doorways, their voices bright and sharp, yet even they seemed to leave space for the quiet I carried with me. At the center of the village, I stopped. The fountain there bubbled softly, its water catching the sunlight. I sat on the edge of it, resting my hands in my lap, feeling the stone's warmth against my palm. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the mountain rose in my mind, not distant, but near, not cold, but steady. Its hum was quieter here, but no less certain. I could still hear it, like a heartbeat beneath everything. When I opened my eyes again, the villagers moved around me without pause. Some glanced my way and nodded. Some simply continued on. All of them carried their own quiet, their own rhythm. And I understood then, the mountain was not only at its peak, it was here, too, in the stones beneath my feet, in the water of the fountain, in the breath of every soul who carried their own memories, their own silence. I remained there a while longer, letting the warmth of the sun and the hum of the stones settle into me, until I felt ready to stand again. And when I did, I walked on. I walked through the village slowly, feeling each step sink into the earth, as though the stones themselves were listening. The morning was fully awake now, sunlight spilling over rooftops and across narrow streets. Yet the air still held the quiet of the mountain, subtle, but undeniable. At a corner where two streets met, an old man sat on a low bench, his hands folded over his knees. He looked up as I passed, his gaze steady and knowing. I paused and nodded to him. He nodded back. No words passed between us, but something did, like the faint echo of wind between stones, a recognition of silence shared. I continued on. Children ran past me, their laughter scattering like birds into the air. One of them, a boy no older than 6, stopped and looked at me curiously. His eyes lingered on the stone in my hand. For a moment, I thought to kneel, to offer it to him, but something in the weight of it told me it was not yet time. So I smiled instead, and he grinned in return before darting away to join his friends. At the edge of the village, I came to a small field where wildflowers swayed in the breeze. I sat there, letting the warmth of the sun soak into my shoulders, letting the faint hum of the mountain settle deeper into my chest. The stone rested in my palm, quiet now, but still alive. I closed my eyes and breathed slowly, feeling the rhythm of the earth beneath me, the hush of the wind above me, the faint sound of water in the distance. When I opened them again, a woman stood a few paces away, watching me. She held a bundle of herbs in her arms, her expression calm but questioning. I inclined my head slightly, and she smiled faintly before moving on. And I realized then, even here, even without words, the mountain spoke. As the day unfolded, I found myself moving without thought through streets, along the river, into quiet courtyards where others sat or worked, or simply waited. Wherever I paused, silence seemed to deepen slightly, just enough for them to notice. They would glance at me, some with curiosity, some with understanding, and then return to whatever they were doing, but softer now, slower. I sat at the fountain again as the sun reached its peak. The water sparkled, and I let my fingers drift through it, watching the ripples stretch and fade. Around me, the village moved at its own gentle pace. The stone in my hand pulsed faintly once, then again reminding me of the summit, of the basin where I had left what I could not keep, of the man who had told me to walk on. I looked down at it and felt a quiet resolve settle into me. I would carry this silence forward, not as a burden, but as a gift. And in time, I would know when to pass it on. The afternoon settled over the village like a soft shawl, warm and quiet. I remained by the fountain longer than I intended, watching the water catch the light and scatter it into faint sparks. The stone in my hand no longer felt like an object. It had become a rhythm, a memory, a quiet that moved through me and into the world around me. At some point, a young man approached and stood near the fountain, his hands buried in his pockets, his shoulders tense. He didn't speak at first, but after a moment, he lowered his gaze to the water and said, "You've been sitting here all day." I looked at him, then nodded. "You're not from here," he added, after a pause. "No," I said softly. Something in my voice seemed to unsettle him, though not in a way he understood. He shifted his weight, glanced at the stone in my hand, and asked, "Why?" I thought about it before answering. "To listen," I said simply. His brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't press further. Instead, he sank onto the edge of the fountain opposite me, staring into the water as though it might answer a question he couldn't name. We sat like that for a long time. Eventually, he rose and walked away without another word, but his steps were slower, more deliberate, as though he too had heard something in the silence. Later, as the shadows lengthened, I wandered through the streets again. Wherever I paused, people seemed to move differently, quieter, softer. At a doorway, a woman stopped mid-sentence when she saw me, then lowered her voice and let the rest of her words fall into the quiet air like petals. At a window, an older man met my gaze and held it for a moment before letting the curtain fall back into place. And at the edge of the river, children who had been shouting and chasing each other stopped and stood still, watching the water flow, their laughter melting into hushed whispers. None of them understood fully, but all of them felt it that something had settled here, something older than words. As dusk began to fall, I climbed a small hill just beyond the village, where the fields rolled gently into the distance. From here, I could see the mountain, its peak wrapped in cloud and dusk. It no longer felt like something I had left behind. It felt closer. I sat there for a long time, letting the sounds of the evening settle around me, the faint sigh of wind through grass, the quiet call of birds, the slow rhythm of the river, and somewhere beneath it all, the hum of the mountain still sang, low and steady, as though reminding me, walk on. When darkness fell fully, lanterns lit the streets below. I descended the hill and wandered through the soft glow of those lights, feeling how each one seemed to echo the faint glow of the stone in my palm. Near the square, I came across the boy from earlier, the one who had stopped to stare at the stone in my hand. He stood at the edge of a small courtyard, watching me intently. When our eyes met, he approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Does it hurt?" he asked, after a moment, his voice barely louder than the hush of the evening. I shook my head. "No," I said gently, "it reminds me." He tilted his head, thinking about that. Of what? I looked toward the mountain, then back at him. "That I am not finished," I said. He smiled faintly, though I could tell he didn't quite understand. Then, after a moment, he reached out and lightly touched the stone in my hand before turning and running back toward the lantern-lit street. I remained there a while longer, standing under the stars as they began to gather above, their faint threads weaving through the dark. And I knew, even here, that my path did not end at the summit. The mountain was not behind me, it was ahead, and so I closed my fingers round the stone, felt its quiet warmth seep into me again, and began to walk into the streets, into the dark, into whatever still waited for me. I wandered deeper into the village, the lanterns casting long, warm shadows on the stones. The streets had quieted now. The rush of the day had faded into a kind of hush, and even the usual chatter from doorways had softened to murmurs. I stopped at a small bridge that crossed the river at the village's edge. Leaning on the wooden rail, I watched the water pass beneath me, its surface dark and glinting where it caught the starlight. In the ripples, I could almost see the faint outline of the mountain reflected there, soft and blurred, but present. As I stood there, someone approached behind me. It was the young man from earlier, the one who had asked why I sat at the fountain. This time he didn't speak right away. He just leaned against the rail a few paces away, watching the river with me. After a while, he said, "It feels different tonight." I glanced at him but didn't reply. He nodded faintly, as though I'd answered anyway. Then, after a pause, he added, "I didn't think quiet could feel like this." And I could hear it in his voice, a new note, low and steady, like a stone settling into its place. He stayed there a little longer, then pushed himself off the rail and walked away without looking back. I moved on through the quiet streets. At a corner, I saw the old man from the bench earlier in the day. He raised his hand in a silent greeting as I passed, his eyes meeting mine with a calm acceptance. Further along, the woman with the bundle of herbs stood in her doorway, her hands now empty. When our eyes met, she smiled softly, then stepped back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. And beyond her, near the square, the boy appeared again. This time he wasn't alone. 2 other children stood with him, their eyes bright and curious. They followed me at a distance as I circled the fountain once more, their whispers faint and full of wonder. At last, the boy took a few hesitant steps forward and spoke. "Did he give you that?" he asked, nodding at the stone in my hand. I looked down at it, feeling its quiet warmth hum against my palm. "Yes," I said. "What does it do?" one of the others asked. I crouched slightly so we were at the same level. "It listens," I said simply. They stared at me a moment longer before nodding solemnly, as though they understood more than I expected. Then they darted away, their soft laughter trailing behind them like wind through grass. Later that night, I sat at the edge of the village square, the fountain behind me and the open fields before me. Above, the stars had gathered fully now, their faint threads weaving through the sky in quiet patterns. I let my eyes follow them, feeling the rhythm of their light echo faintly in my chest. From here, I could hear the village breathing, the soft creak of shutters closing, the muffled sound of footsteps on stone, the distant hush of the river, and though no one spoke, I could feel it clearly. The mountain was here too. It hummed through the stones beneath me, through the air between houses, through the quiet gestures of those who moved in its presence without knowing its name. I closed my eyes and felt my own breath join that rhythm, steady and calm, like water flowing over stone. The mountain no longer felt like a place. It felt like a part of everything and everyone. I rose and began to walk again, through the sleeping streets and into the fields beyond. At the edge of the grass, where the earth began to rise toward the hills, I paused and looked back. The village lay behind me, lanterns glowing faintly, shadows stretching long, and in those lights, in those shadows, I saw it, the faint outline of the mountain, reflected in the lives of those who had begun to feel its silence, its steadiness, its quiet song. And I understood then that the mountain had not only taught me to carry its silence, it had taught me to plant it. And so I walked on. The fields beyond the village stretched wide and quiet under the night sky. The grasses swayed gently in the breeze, their tips catching the faint starlight as though sprinkled with silver. I walked slowly, letting each step sink into the earth, letting the rhythm of my breath match the soft hush of the wind. Behind me, the lanterns of the village dimmed with distance, their glow merging with the horizon until they were no more than faint embers. And ahead of me, only the fields and the hills, the faint outline of the mountain always just at the corner of my vision, not behind, not ahead, but within. As I walked, I thought of the man on the summit, the way his gaze had cut through the clouds, the way his words had carried the weight of silence without heaviness. His voice still lingered somewhere in me, woven into the faint hum of the stone in my hand. "Walk on," he had said, and I understood now. Walking was no longer about arriving, it was about carrying the quiet of the mountain through the noise of the world, carrying the rhythm of the stone into places where the air forgot to breathe, carrying the memory of that basin at the peak, where every burden could be laid down and every breath became a prayer. Somewhere in the fields, I came to a small rise where the grass gave way to bare earth. I stopped there and sat, feeling the cool soil beneath my fingers. The sky stretched wide above me. From here, the stars were brighter still, their faint threads weaving patterns I no longer tried to understand. It was enough to see them, to feel them. I closed my eyes and listened. The earth hummed faintly, the same deep, steady hum I'd heard in the stone circle, in the summit's basin, in the heart of the tree clinging to the cliff. It was everywhere now, and nowhere. I realized then that the mountain had not simply given me its silence, it had shown me that the silence was already mine. After a while, I opened my eyes again. The grasses swayed softly in the wind, their quiet rustle filling the night air. At the edge of the rise, a small fox stood watching me, its eyes catching the starlight. We regarded each other without urgency. Then it turned and padded off into the dark, leaving only the faint impression of its presence in the flattened grass. I smiled faintly and rose to my feet. I began to walk again, the hills rolling gently around me, the path no longer clear but no longer necessary. I passed through hollows where the grass whispered louder, where the earth smelled rich and alive. I passed under a stand of slender trees, their leaves shimmering faintly as though stirred by some quiet laughter. And all the while, the mountain remained, not as a shape in the distance, but as a weightless warmth in my chest, as the faint glow of the stone in my hand. I thought of the people in the village, the boy, the young man by the fountain, the woman in her doorway. Each of them had felt it too, though they didn't yet know how to name it, and perhaps they never would. But that didn't matter. Some things are not meant to be named, only carried. As the first faint blush of dawn began to touch the edges of the sky, I stopped again at the crest of a hill. Below me lay another valley, another river, another quiet place waiting to be walked through. I stood there for a long time, feeling the earth breathe beneath me, the wind curled gently around me, the stars slowly fading above me, and I whispered softly, to no one in particular, "I have walked far," and somewhere in the quiet that followed, the mountain answered back, as it always did, not with words, but with the steady hum of its silence. As the sun rose fully, its light spilled across the hills in gentle waves, turning the fields into a patchwork of golden green. I walked slowly now, not because I was tired, but because each step felt deliberate, as though the earth itself was teaching me to move differently, softer, steadier, more present. At a bend in the hills, I came across a narrow path that cut between two low ridges. The ground here was cooler, shaded by overhanging branches that swayed faintly in the morning breeze. And as I passed through, I felt it again, the faint hum of the mountain, alive and quiet, as though the stones themselves still remembered my feet. I paused in the center of that path and placed a hand against the ridge wall. It was warm to the touch, and beneath my palm, the rhythm pulsed faintly, not loud, but certain. I closed my eyes and let it settle into me. When I opened them again, the path ahead seemed clearer, though nothing had changed. Farther along, I came upon a small settlement nestled in a hollow. It was smaller than the village I had left, just a handful of houses, a well at the center, and a few people moving quietly about their day. As I approached, a man carrying a basket glanced up at me. For a moment, his eyes lingered on the stone in my hand, then on my face. He didn't speak, but his shoulders seemed to relax slightly as he nodded and continued on. I walked to the well and sat on its edge. The water below was dark, still catching faint glimmers of light as a single rope swayed gently above it. After a few moments, a young girl appeared, barefoot, her hands full of herbs. She stopped when she saw me, her gaze curious but calm. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. I smiled faintly and gestured to the well. "Listening," I said. She tilted her head, as though trying to hear it herself. Then she knelt at the edge, her small fingers brushing the stones, her ear bent close to the opening. I watched her eyes widen slightly before she sat back and looked at me. "I think I hear it," she whispered. I nodded. "You will," I said. She stood, still holding her herbs, and ran off toward one of the houses, glancing back only once before disappearing inside. The day passed slowly, as I remained near the well, watching the settlement move around me. I didn't speak again, but here too, I felt it, in the way people's voices softened as they passed, in the way their steps quieted without thinking. The calm had begun to spread, not because I willed it, but because the mountain willed it through me. At one point, an older woman came and sat beside me. She didn't ask who I was or why I was there. She simply placed her hand over mine, resting lightly on the stone, and closed her eyes. For a long time we sat like that. When she finally rose, she met my gaze and gave me a faint, knowing smile before returning to her work. As evening approached, I left the settlement and continued along the path, the stone still warm in my palm. The sky above had begun to shift into shades of soft orange and deep indigo, and the faint threads of stars had started to emerge, weaving their quiet patterns once more. I climbed another low hill and stood at its crest, looking out over the fields, the rivers, and the distant mountains. And I felt it clearly now. The silence I carried was no longer mine alone. It moved through the people I passed, through the stones beneath their feet, through the water in their wells. It had become part of the world itself. I closed my eyes and let the wind move through me, carrying with it whispers of places I had yet to walk, of voices I had yet to meet. And I understood then that the mountain was not a single peak, but 1,000, each one waiting, each one humming its quiet song into the hearts of those willing to hear. I opened my eyes and whispered softly into the dusk, "I will walk to them all." And the faint hum of the earth below answered me, as it always did, steady, quiet, unbroken. And so I walked on. The night deepened as I walked, and the air cooled until each breath felt like a quiet offering to the stars above. The hills fell away behind me, and the land stretched out flat and dark, the faint glow of distant villages dotting the horizon like scattered embers. Above, the stars continued their quiet weaving, their faint threads drawing shapes I no longer tried to decipher. I simply walked beneath them, letting their rhythm fold into mine. At times, the wind would rise and carry with it a memory, the soft echo of water over stones, the faint voice of the man at the summit, the stillness of the basin where burdens were left behind. And at times, even that would fade, leaving only the hush of my own footsteps over the earth. As dawn approached, the sky ahead began to glow faintly, not gold this time but silver, as though the sun itself hesitated just beyond the edge of the world. I came upon another rise, and at its crest, I stopped. From here, the land fell away into a vast plain that shimmered faintly in the soft pre-dawn light. And beyond it, far beyond it, mountains rose once more, higher than any I had yet climbed. But it was not their height that caught me. It was what lay between here and there, a silence even deeper than the one I had known. It spread across the plain like water, still and unbroken, as though waiting. And as I stood there, I realized something I had not understood before. The silence of the mountain had been only the beginning, a single note in a much larger song. I descended into the plain slowly, each step swallowed by the hush that stretched in every direction. There were no paths here, no stones etched with lines, no trees clinging to cliffs, only grass that swayed faintly, and air that tasted of something older than memory. Even the faint hum of the stone in my hand quieted here, not gone, but folded into the greater quiet of the plain. For a long time I walked without pause, without thought. It felt as though the earth beneath me breathed in rhythm with my steps, as though it carried me forward, even when I could no longer see where forward was. At some point, I came upon a shallow hollow where a single pool of water mirrored the stars above. I knelt beside it and touched its surface. It was warm, and as it rippled under my fingers, faint images rose and fell, moments I could not name, faces I had never seen, yet all of them familiar in some quiet way. I let them pass without trying to hold them, and when the water stilled again, I rose and continued. Hours, or perhaps days, passed as I crossed the plain. I no longer marked the time. The stars faded and returned, the horizon shifted and settled, the faint silver glow of the dawn came and went, but I walked on, steady, quiet. At one point, I thought I heard faint bells in the distance, soft and low, carried by a wind I could not feel. I stopped and closed my eyes, letting the sound seep into me. It was not the bells of the summit, nor the melody of the mountain. It was something more, something wider, deeper, something waiting. When I opened my eyes again, the mountains beyond the plain loomed closer now, their peaks hidden in clouds that shimmered faintly in the starlight. And though my feet ached and the air grew thinner, I felt no hesitation. The stone in my hand pulsed faintly again, slower now, but steady, and the faint hum of the earth rose to meet it. I understood then that the silence I carried was not only for those I had already met, but for those yet to come, and that even here, even in this vast and waiting quiet, the mountain walked with me. I stopped once more at the edge of a shallow ridge and looked back. The plain stretched behind me, dotted with faint lights of villages, faint traces of paths I could no longer see. And yet, I felt no distance at all. The mountain was here. The villagers were here. The boy, the woman, the summit, the well, all of it here. In the quiet rhythm of my breath and the steady hum of the stone in my palm, I whispered softly to the air, "I will walk to them all." And somewhere far ahead, the faint sound of bells answered me, quiet and certain, as though saying, then walk on. And so I did. The mountains ahead grew sharper with each step, their peaks cutting into the sky like quiet blades. Clouds gathered around them, shimmering faintly in the dim light, shifting as though they breathed. The plain behind me receded into a hush so complete that even my own footsteps seemed to fade. And yet, I did not feel alone. At times, when the wind curled through the grasses, I caught whispers of voices I'd never heard, or perhaps had always known. They were soft, steady, carried on the air like the faint threads above, and they said nothing more than this: "We are walking to..." I stopped at a low ridge where the earth rose into scattered stones and sat there for a long time. Above, the stars had begun to gather once more, their faint patterns crossing and weaving in ways that no longer puzzled me. I knew now they did not ask to be understood, only carried, and as I sat, I felt something new in the silence, not heavy, not sharp, but full. It was no longer just my silence, it was the silence of the mountain, and the plain, and the sky, and of all those who had walked before, and all those who would walk after. It settled into my chest like warmth on cold stone. When I rose again, the path ahead had changed. It was no longer a single trail, but many faint tracks etched into the earth, some straight, some winding, all converging toward the mountains ahead. And along those tracks, I began to see figures. At first, only silhouettes at the very edge of sight, but slowly, as I walked, they came into view, men and women, young and old, each carrying something of their own. Some walked alone, their eyes fixed on the peaks. Others moved together, quietly, with the kind of ease that comes from having shared a long silence. And though none of them spoke, they all carried the same quiet in their steps, the same steady rhythm in their breath. One of them, a boy no older than the one from the village, turned his head as I passed. His gaze lingered on the stone in my hand, and for a moment his lips curved into the faintest smile before he continued on.
Another, an old woman, her hands lined and steady, met my eyes as she passed, and in her calm expression I saw a quiet recognition, as though she too had stood on a summit and left her burdens behind. I kept walking, and they kept walking too, some ahead, some behind, some alongside me, and though none of us spoke, the silence between us was full of something more than words could hold.
As the night deepened, we reached the base of the first peak. Here, the air grew sharper, colder, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and stone. At the base of the slope stood a wide circle of stones, each one glowing faintly in the dark. I paused at its edge, feeling the hum of the mountain rise through my feet, into my chest, into the stone still warm in my palm. One by one, the others entered the circle, placing their stones at its center before stepping back and waiting. When at last it was my turn, I stepped forward, knelt, and placed my stone with theirs. The circle glowed brighter, and for a moment the faint threads above seemed to bend toward it, weaving a pattern that shimmered and settled into the stones. Then I stood and joined the others. We stood there a long time, watching the light at the circle's heart, and though no one spoke, I understood clearly now. This was not only my journey, it had never been only mine. Each of us carried the silence of the mountain, and each of us would plant it wherever we walked. And even as we moved on, that silence would remain, waiting for those who came after. When the light at the circle finally dimmed, the old woman turned to me, her eyes bright with something quiet and certain. "Walk on," she said softly, and it was his voice I heard in hers, so I did. We began to climb just before dawn, the circle of stones fading behind us into the darkness. The air grew colder, sharper with each step, and yet it carried with it a strange sweetness, the kind of sweetness that only comes when you have walked long enough to notice it. Around me, the others moved at their own pace, some ahead, some behind, all silent but steady. We did not speak, but I could feel the quiet that connected us, as though every breath we took together added another thread to the great pattern above. The slope here was different from the first mountain. It was steeper, but the stones were smoother, worn by countless footsteps that had passed this way before. Sometimes I would glance up and see the faint outline of someone far ahead, silhouetted against the sky. Sometimes I would glance back and catch the quiet gaze of someone behind me, their face calm and unhurried. But always, no matter where we were, the silence held us, not heavy, not oppressive, but vast, alive, as though the mountain itself were watching us and breathing with us. After a time, we reached a ledge where the path narrowed into a ridge that wound upward in long, slow arcs. The stars above had faded now into a pale grey sky, but the faint threads of light still shimmered faintly, weaving through the clouds. Here, the air felt even thinner, but I no longer struggled to breathe. Each breath felt full, even when shallow, full of the hum of the stones, the faint scent of frost, the warmth that still glowed in my chest. The stone I had left in the circle no longer weighed on me, but I could still feel its rhythm inside me, as though once given, it had become something that could not be lost. At one turn in the ridge, I paused. Below, the plain stretched vast and quiet, the faint trails of others still visible in the grass. Ahead, the peak disappeared into the clouds, their edges silvered by the first light of the sun, and in that light, I saw them, not just the ones climbing now, but all the others who had ever walked this way. Their shapes shimmered faintly on the ridge above. Below, beyond, countless figures moving slowly, their silence rising together into the air like a soft song. And I understood then, the mountain was not climbed alone. It never had been. We continued upward. The ridge curved higher, and at times the stones gave way to smooth ice, cold beneath our feet, but not treacherous. The wind rose here, sharper now, carrying whispers. I could almost understand words that slipped between sound and meaning before fading back into the air. At one point, I reached out and placed my hand against the icy rock. It was cold, but within that cold, there was a faint warmth like a heartbeat buried deep beneath the stone. I closed my eyes and listened, and for the first time I heard it clearly. Not the hum of a single mountain, but the low, endless rhythm of them all, echoing into one another, weaving a silence too vast for any one of us to carry alone. When I opened my eyes again, the others had paused as well. One by one, they placed their hands against the stones, closing their eyes, listening, and though no one spoke, I could feel it that each of us heard the same rhythm, though in a different way, each of us carrying our own thread of it. When the last of us opened their eyes again, we continued, moving higher into the clouds. The path narrowed again until it was little more than a line cut into the rock, the air thick with mist, and yet the silence here felt brighter, clearer, as though each step stripped away another layer of noise I had carried without knowing it. At last, we emerged onto a small plateau, surrounded by clouds so thick they glowed faintly from within. Here, the ground was smooth and dark, and at its center stood a single stone, taller than a man, etched with faint lines that shimmered softly in the dim light. We gathered around it without needing to speak. One by one, each traveler placed their hand against the stone, then stepped back, their faces calm, their eyes bright with something quiet and certain. When my turn came, I stepped forward and rested my palm against its surface. The stone was cool, and within its lines, I felt not just one mountain, but all of them, every peak I had climbed, every silence I had carried, every figure who had ever walked beside me. It was not only my journey anymore, it never had been. I stepped back and looked around at the others. Their eyes met mine, and in that quiet gaze, I saw what I had always carried, and what they carried too. And in that moment, I understood more deeply than ever before. The silence does not belong to any one of us, it belongs to the walk itself. And so, when the clouds above parted just enough to reveal the faintest hint of the next peak, I whispered to no one in particular, "Walk on," and as one, we did. The clouds began to thin as we climbed higher still, their edges glowing faintly, as though lit from within by some quiet fire. The stone we had touched at the plateau remained behind us now, yet its rhythm lingered in my palm. In my chest, a gentle pulse reminding me with each step that nothing was truly left behind. Around me, the others moved in silence, their figures half shrouded in mist, their breath visible in the cold air. Above, the faintest hint of blue began to seep through the clouds, and I felt that familiar warmth rise again, steady, calm, alive. At last, the path leveled out, opening onto a broad expanse of smooth rock that curved gently upward toward a single peak, so sharp it seemed to pierce the very sky. We stood there at the base of that final rise, and for the first time in what felt like many lifetimes, I understood something simple and profound. There was no summit, or rather, the summit was not what I thought it was. Ahead, the path faded into the light. It did not end, it simply became something else. We moved forward together, each step slower now, not from weariness but from reverence. The The stones beneath our feet seemed softer here, warmer, as though they remembered every soul that had passed this way. The air carried no wind, no cold, only stillness, deep and full, as though the mountain itself were holding its breath. At one point, I glanced to my side and saw the young boy from the village again, or perhaps only a memory of him, his small face calm, his gaze fixed ahead. Beyond him, I saw the old woman, her eyes bright, her hands folded before her, walking with the same quiet purpose, and beyond them, countless others, their forms shimmering faintly in the mist, each of them carrying the silence in their own way. We reached a point where the stones gave way to smooth white light, neither snow nor rock, but something softer, brighter, alive. Here, the air felt lighter still, and the faint threads above seemed to descend toward us, weaving through the light at our feet. One by one, the others slowed and stopped, each finding their place on the expanse of white, each turning their gaze upward, as though waiting for something only they could see. I too slowed, letting my hands fall to my sides, feeling the faint hum of the stones rising through me one final time. And as I stood there, I felt it clearly. The walk was not about reaching a peak, it was about becoming part of it. Ahead, the faint glow coalesced into a circle of stones, taller and broader than any before, their surfaces etched with lines that shimmered softly as though alive. At the center of the circle stood a single figure, robed and still, his face hidden by the light. I knew him, not from memory, but from silence. It was the man from the first mountain, and yet not him, not as I had known him. Perhaps he was all of them. Perhaps he was only the quiet that had walked with me all this time. He raised his hand, and I stepped forward, feeling the warmth of the stones, the weightless rhythm of the threads above, the faint pulse in my chest align into a single, steady beat. When I reached the center of the circle, he spoke. "You have walked far," he said, and his voice carried not just through the air, but through the stones, the sky, the silence itself. I nodded, though the words I might have said dissolved before they could leave my lips. "You have listened," he continued, and I understood then that every step, every pause, every breath had been an answer to a question I had never needed to ask. "You have planted the silence," he said, and with that, he lowered his hand, and the faint hum in my chest bloomed outward, filling the circle, rising into the threads above, weaving into their quiet pattern. For a long time, we stood there, he and I, and all the others, as the light above wove itself through the stones, through us, through the air, and then he spoke once more, his voice barely a whisper now, though it carried easily into the deepest quiet. "Walk on," he said, and as the words settled into me, I realized that even here at what I thought was the end, the path continued. The silence had no summit, only steps. And so, when the figure lowered his gaze and stepped back into the light, I too turned toward the faint threads ahead and began to walk again. The light ahead was neither brighter nor darker than before, but it had changed. It no longer fell from above or rose from the stones. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, soft yet vast, enveloping everything. I stepped into it without hesitation, and as I walked, the stones beneath me faded, the threads above dissolved into the glow, and even the air seemed to melt into something weightless. Yet I still felt the ground, the breath in my chest, the faint hum of the silence, steady and alive. I was not walking on the mountain anymore. I was walking through the mountain, through its memory, its rhythm, its endless quiet. Shapes appeared and dissolved as I moved forward, faint outlines of paths I had walked before, ridges I had climbed, stones I had touched. Each shimmered for a moment, then folded back into the light, leaving only the faint impression that they had never been separate from it. And as I walked, I began to understand. Around me now, the figures of the others began to emerge again, though they no longer walked on stone. Some drifted beside me, their forms faint but certain, their silence woven into the same rhythm that filled my chest. Some lingered farther ahead, their outlines shining softly before merging back into the light, and some countless, endless, moved somewhere beyond sight, their presence felt but unseen, like threads tightening and loosening around me. I understood then that all of us walked together, even when we seemed alone. At one point, I stopped and closed my eyes, and even in the weightless quiet, I could feel it, the faint pulse of the stone that had been placed in my palm long ago, now indistinguishable from the hum of everything around me. It was not a burden. It had never been a burden. It was the proof of walking, the shape of silence given form, the memory of countless steps, countless breaths, countless voices that had risen and fallen and risen again. When I opened my eyes, the light before me had changed again. It curved now, upward and outward, like the inside of a vast circle, its edges lined with faint glimmers of motion, as though all the paths I had ever walked were turning gently back toward me, weaving themselves into the same quiet whole. At the center of it all, a faint figure stood, not the man from the first mountain, nor the woman at the circle, nor the boy at the fountain. And yet, it was all of them, and it was me. I approached slowly, and as I did, the silence deepened. Not heavy, not frightening, but full, alive, a quiet, too vast to name. The figure raised its head, and though its features were hidden in the light, I saw in it every step I had ever taken, every breath I had ever drawn, every burden I had ever left behind. And as I stood before it, I understood. There was no beginning to this path, and there was no end. Only walking, only silence, only the quiet rhythm of the mountain, pulsing through everything. The figure lifted a hand and gestured softly, and though no words passed between us, I heard the message clearly. You have become what you sought. The mountain, the silence, the walk, all of it, here, alive in me. I bowed my head, closed my eyes, and let the rhythm of that vast quiet settle fully into me. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone, but its presence remained, not ahead, not behind, but within, woven into the faint light and the threads that stretched endlessly in every direction. And so, once more, I whispered into the quiet, "Walk on." And the silence answered me, as it always did, soft, certain, endless. And so I did. I walked on. The light around me began to soften, its brightness no longer blinding, its warmth no longer separate from my own. It flowed into me with each breath, each step, as though I had become part of it, or perhaps as though I had always been. The figures around me moved as well, their forms faint and quiet, yet undeniably there. Some drifted ahead, others walked beside me, and still more followed far behind, their shapes weaving in and out of the great silence that held us all. And as we moved, I began to understand something deeper than before. Every step I took now was no longer only mine. Each one carried the memory of those who had walked before the boy at the fountain, the woman in her doorway, the old man on his bench, the countless others whose voices I'd felt in the stones, the wind, the water. Every breath I drew was theirs too, the rhythm of the mountain passing through all of us, unchanged, yet always becoming. And with each step, I felt their presence in me, the boy's curiosity, the woman's quiet strength, the old man's calm acceptance, the man at the summit's steady guidance. They were here, and so was I. Ahead, the path began to widen again, curving into another great circle of stones. But this circle was different. It had no center, it was all center. The stones glowed faintly, etched with countless lines that shimmered and shifted as though alive, their patterns weaving in and out of each other, like the threads above. And within the circle moved countless figures, more than I could count, more than I could comprehend. Each walked at their own pace, but all moved with the same quiet purpose, each carrying their silence like a small flame in the dark. I stepped into the circle without hesitation, and the silence deepened. Here, no one looked at me directly, but each person's presence spoke clearly. You were not alone. I moved through them, feeling their quiet settle into me, feeling my own quiet settle into them. Some carried stones like the one I once held, some carried nothing at all, and yet we all carried the same thing, the memory of walking, the silence of the mountain, the promise of moving forward. At the far edge of the circle, the path began again, narrow at first, then widening into a great expanse that stretched farther than sight could follow. I paused there and looked back at the circle, and in its quiet rhythm, I saw everything. Every mountain I had climbed, every stone I had left behind, every face I had met, every silence I had learned to hear, all of it alive, all of it here, not separate, not finished, only walking. As I turned back to the path ahead, I felt something shift in me, not heavy, not sharp, but full, steady. I realized then, I no longer walked for myself, I walked for them, for the boy who had touched the stone, for the woman who had smiled without words, for the old man who had nodded without question, for the others who moved in silence beside me, and for the countless more who would one day follow this path. Every step now was theirs as much as mine. and the silence I carried was no longer just the mountain's gift to me, it was my gift to them. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the rhythm of the stones, the hum of the threads, the quiet of the circle settle into me one final time. When I opened them again, I whispered softly, "Walk on." And from somewhere deep within the silence, and from the countless figures around me, the answer came, steady and certain, "We walk with you." So I did. The path stretched ahead of me, wide and open now, yet no less quiet. The stones beneath my feet had become soft, almost like sand, and the light around me had shifted once again, not bright, not dark, but something in between, alive with a gentle warmth. Each step carried the faint hum of the mountain within it, but it no longer came from beneath me, nor from the stones I had once held. It came from everywhere, from the figures walking beside me, from the threads weaving above, from the circle of stones fading into the distance, from the silence itself. And I realized the mountain was walking through me now. Just as I walked through it, I passed others on the path. Some walked quickly, their eyes fixed ahead. Some moved slowly, pausing often to breathe, to listen. Some stopped entirely, standing still in the glow, as though waiting for something only they could hear. And as I moved through them, they moved through me, our silences mingling, our steps becoming part of the same quiet rhythm. I saw the boy again, no longer a child, but something older, steadier. He glanced at me as I passed, his lips curving into a soft smile before he turned and continued on his own way. I saw the woman too, her hands now empty, her eyes brighter than I remembered. She met my gaze with calm certainty before stepping onto a path that branched softly into the light. And I saw the man from the first summit, his figure robed and still, his eyes quiet and endless, standing at a bend in the path, watching, waiting. I nodded to him as I passed, and though he said nothing, I felt his voice in the silence around me. "You have always been walking." At some point, the path rose slightly, curving upward into a broad expanse of light. Here, the figures around me began to disperse, each finding their own direction, their own rhythm. Some faded into the light entirely, some lingered at its edges, some turned and walked back toward the circles below, carrying the silence to those who had just begun. And still, I walked on. The threads above wove tighter now, their patterns more intricate, their faint hum louder than before, though it was no longer sound, but something deeper, something that moved through me as easily as breath. I stopped once at a crest where the light pooled around me like water and looked back, and I saw everything. The plains and the hills, the villages and rivers, the first mountain, the well, the fountain, the boy, the woman, the countless others, all of it stretched out like a great tapestry, shimmering with the faint glow of every step, every breath, every silence. And in its center, faint but certain, the pulse of the mountain, steady, alive, unbroken. I turned back to the path ahead, and I understood then there was no summit waiting. No finale circle, no single figure standing at the end. There was only the walk. And it did not end, because it had never begun. We are always walking. We are always carrying the silence forward. We are always planting it where it can grow. I lowered my gaze to the path beneath me and saw my own steps glimmering faintly now, weaving into the pattern that stretched endlessly ahead. I smiled, not with joy, nor with sadness, but with quiet knowing. And softly, I whispered once more, "Walk on." And this time, the silence answered me not as an echo, but as my own voice, carried on the threads above and the stones below and the breath of every figure walking still, always. And so I did. I walked on. The path ahead shimmered faintly, its edges soft, its stones warm beneath my feet. The light around me was quiet now, no longer shifting, no longer growing brighter or dimmer, but steady, as though it had found its true shape. And as I moved through it, I felt my own silence settle fully into me, no longer separate from the mountain, no longer something to carry or to give. It was me. The figures around me began to thin, each finding their own way into the glow. Some paused and turned back, their eyes meeting mine for a moment before they faded softly into the threads. Others continued alongside me, their steps matching mine for a while before veering off onto their own quiet paths. And some moved ahead so far that they became no more than faint outlines in the distance, shimmering, certain, eternal. Yet even as they disappeared, I felt them, all of them. Every step they took was still here. Every breath they drew was still here. Every silence they carried still hummed in the stones beneath my feet, in the threads above, in the rhythm that had no beginning and no end. At a certain point, I came to a place where the path widened into a great open expanse. Here, the stones were smooth and pale, their faint etchings weaving into patterns so vast I could no longer see their edges, and at its center stood nothing, no figure, no circle, no summit, only the quiet, alive, waiting, everywhere. I stopped there and stood for a long time. I closed my eyes and listened, and in the silence I heard it all. The boy at the fountain, the woman in her doorway, the old man on his bench, the man at the summit, the hum of the stones, the whisper of the wind, the faint echo of the river, the warmth of the stone in my hand, the rhythm of the mountain in my chest. All of it, not memories, not burdens, not even lessons, just walking, just silence, just the steady quiet of steps carried forward by countless souls. When I opened my eyes again, the threads above stretched out infinitely, their faint shimmer weaving through everything. I looked down and saw my own steps joining them, my silence folding into theirs, my walk becoming indistinguishable from the path itself. And I understood, finally, the walk never ends because it never began. The silence is not given because it was never absent. And the mountain is not climbed because we have always been its stones, its air, its quiet. So I smiled softly to myself, not because I had arrived, but because there was nowhere left to arrive to. And in the quiet that followed, I whispered once more, though no one remained to hear it but the silence itself, "Walk on." And this time, no answer came, because it no longer needed to. I took another step, and another, and another, and the silence walked with me, as it always had, as it always will.